We are going to go through this second edition, Chapter 11 notes. Okay, so everything in this PowerPoint will be pretty well aligned to your current edition. It's just the figures might be more updated in your textbook than what you're seeing here. But Chapter 11 focuses on agriculture and feeding the human population on a global scale. So when we talk about feeding people, we need to understand that there's a lot of people worldwide that do not have enough food. Even though we produce and we are able to grow a lot of food on a global scale, there's a vast amount of population, vast amount of people that do not have access to food. Okay, so they are going through this undernutrition scenario. When we talk about undernutrition, that means that your body is not receiving enough calories to maintain its health. Okay. When we talk about malnutrition, that means that you are not eating very balanced diet. Okay, so you don't get enough protein as opposed to carbohydrates, vitamins, and nutrients. Like I said, with certain parts of the world, there may not be enough food to go around because of political issues or just access to food. And that's what food security comes into play, where people do not have access to that reliable source of food. So here's a graph, and again, this is a little dated, indicating the global undernutrition. And fortunately, the numbers of people that do not have access to well-balanced diet is decreasing. However, it's still above what the target is, okay? And again, political dilemma comes into play because of governments that will prevent getting food, or perhaps there's conflicts between different countries that their populations may not be provided that access to food. If your population is exposed to this lack of food, you may have what's called a famine, where a large number of individuals are dying, and the deaths are related to starvation or malnutrition. When you are anemic, that means that your body does not have enough iron in its system, and it's generally linked to poor diet. Not always, but oftentimes it is. Okay. What you also may have is a overnutrition, where we actually see that in more developed countries, where people receive or eat too many calories, which will lead to obesity, right? And oftentimes those calories that people consume do not have, or the foods they consume do not provide very much in terms of nutritional values. So those are foods that will be high in high fructose corn syrup, but they will not have many vitamins and minerals. Okay, so those processed foods may lead to this overnutrition issue. Meat is generally the livestock, so your pigs, your cows that you may eat, lamb that you may eat, or poultry like chicken or turkey or ducks, right, that we may consume as part of our diet. Humans should have a well-balanced diet, and we do have about 50,000 plants that we could eat. However, only 3 of them will will compose most of our diet. Okay, so if you think about corn, think about rice, and think about wheat, how much of that product or byproduct of those grains compose of our diet, right? There's a lot. Meat is the second most consumed type of food, and the more developed a country is, the higher the meat intake it has. Okay, so poorer countries will generally rely on plant-based diet. Developed countries will be much more meat heavy. Okay, here's an example of that, where United States and how it compares to a global meat consumption. We definitely eat a lot more meat than anywhere else in the world. So like I said, there are a few reasons why population might be exposed to this malnutrition, and oftentimes poverty is the leading cause of that. Simply, people cannot afford to buy good quality foods. Think about the guy, the TED Talk that we watched when he talked about the food desert, right? You're talking about population that's on a lower income scale in California, and they do not have access to good quality foods, right? You had liquor stores and fast food restaurants, which does not provide very good nutrient-rich type of diet, either for you, your spouse, or your kids, right? Political unrest and poor government is also, going hand in hand with that. Also, if you are living in an area where food prices are really high and people can't afford the food prices or the food to be purchased, they are not going to buy good quality foods. If you think about the meal planning activity that you guys did in class, right? For the most part, because you were so limited on income, you probably didn't feed your family fresh fruits and vegetables and, finest pieces of meat and, fish and whatnot, right? We tend to skip to the more processed, cheaper food alternatives that do not carry much in terms of nutritional value. And unfortunately, we see that. We see that in poorer communities, there's a lot more obese people, which doesn't go really hand in hand, because you think, well, you're obese because you eat so much. But why are you eat so much when you don't have the money? Well, the food that you can afford is garbage food, right? That will lead to this obesity issues. So as the time progressed since the 1950s, we have produced a lot more grain on a global scale. But the consumption has decreased, okay? Now, the reason why we can produce a lot more food right now, it's partially due to the fact that biotechnology is so widely accepted now, right? We do have those genetically modified organisms that allow us to grow better crops. So when we talk about now looking at these large-scale farming methods, what I want you to keep in mind is that those big farming operations are very different than what we would see historically in smaller family-owned farms, right? We are now looking at agriculture as a type of business. Those are huge operations, and they have huge costs affiliated with those farms. Some of you might live on a farm where, your parents or grandparents or the entire family runs this farming operation, right? The costs are enormous. The cost that's affiliated with farming is also much higher, right? The amount of fuel that we use is going to be very different than what was used 100 years ago. Right? 100 years ago on your farm, you may have had 2 horses that would, pull the plow behind them as you plowed your field. Right now, you have a huge equipment to do that for you. Okay, so we can look at the cost in terms of fuel, in cost of maintaining and producing that grain, for example, as opposed to what its outcome is in terms of calories. So it may take 20 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of beef, right? Because if you think about how much does this cow need to eat to produce that kilogram of meat over that of their lifetime, right? Most of the energy that's being utilized, like I said, is to operate equipment, right? In terms of using those fossil fuels. Not only do we use equipment to go through fields and whatnot, but you also need to transport your seed. You need to then go through and cut your harvest, and then perhaps take it to a granary, and then that needs to be processed and perhaps bagged as flour and then shipped to the store. And then you have to go to the store to pick up that bag of flour and drive it home, right? So the amount of fuel that's needed for that bag of flour to make it to your home is enormous. And we can look at this in terms of energy subsidy, right? How much does it take to produce what we ultimately bring home? So we have these new technologies that will allow us to have higher yields in terms of food that we can produce, right? Either it be meat or grain. We talk about the Green Revolution as a shift in agricultural practices over a period of time where we do start using different types of machines. We started using fertilizers. We started using irrigation. Now we're spraying for pests to protect our crops. All those things led to higher food production, higher food output. Okay. And then, like I said, the cost of operating larger farm is very different than the cost of operating smaller family farm. When you farm, 1,500 acres, your costs are going to be different and your spending is going to feel differently than, let's say, if you're on a family farm that has maybe 15 or 20 acres. Right? If you need to invest $100,000 in a piece of equipment, it might feel different to this operation that has 1,500 acres as opposed to somebody that has 15. Right? Your cost to what you're going to get out of it is going to be different. We do utilize irrigation. Irrigation is this artificial watering of fields. That causes a couple of issues. If you remember from when we talked about water and how well systems can actually pull too much of groundwater, causing these cones of depression, or they might, if you're near a coastal area, they might actually pull some of that salt water towards your fresh groundwater. That's another issue. So that's something that farmers that run big irrigation operation might need to consider. right? A waterlogging is a type of soil degradation where the soil is exposed to too much water. That water does not seep through the soil fast enough. Salinization is something that you guys are studying right now with your seeds growing in your petri dishes. Where you have too much salt, and I'm hoping that you guys have seen the pattern with your seed germination. If you have too much salt, your crops are not going to do very well. Right? So those salts are accumulating over a period of time from the water that's being irrigated onto those fields. The water evaporates, leaving all the salt behind. Right? So your soil has too high of salt content. Right? This is kind of what it's indicated here on these two pictures, right? You have the waterlogging and then the salinization where you have too much salt being left behind in the soil. We do use fertilizers, and you may have a synthetic or organic fertilizer. Your organic fertilizer can, let's say if you are at home and you want to produce your own organic fertilizer, all you got to do is have a compost pile. And pretty much what you do is you throw your scraps of fruits, vegetables, you can put coffee grounds, you can put brown paper bags in your compost pile, some unprocessed newspapers that are not printed on a shiny paper with color inks, because those may have some chemicals in there that you don't want in your compost. But you can throw all those things and just let it sit, right? And over time, you can, once or twice a year, you can go in and turn the compost, and that produces a very nutrient-rich fertilizer. And then you can spread it on your garden to produce that, or to give those nutrients to your plants. A synthetic fertilizer is one that's made in factories by synthetic means. Also known and oftentimes listed or labeled in a store-bought fertilizer as inorganic fertilizer. What we see around here is a great example of fields that are planted with monocrops, meaning there's only one plant growing in the field. And what we have here around us is corn and soybeans. And that's pretty much all you see, right? No matter where you drive in northern Illinois, you got corn and you got soybeans. There are some issues with that. The pests that might be present in a monoculture type of field are going to be a lot more successful than in a field or in a garden that has a variety of plants growing in there. If you have a disease sweeping through a field of monocrop, it is going to be pretty devastating. So farmers will use pesticides to be sprayed on their plants to make sure that pests do not spread quickly through their crops. Insecticides are going to target insects, okay, that might consume those plants. And then herbicides are going to be sprayed on plants that will compete with whatever you're trying to grow. If you have ever heard or used a Roundup, that is a herbicide that is going to kill any plants that are not, quote, Roundup ready, end quote. A lot of the Monsanto corn that's being grown around the world is Roundup ready, meaning that you can spray Roundup on it and that corn is not affected by it. So what that gives the benefit to the farmer is that they can go in and do an aerial spray of Roundup. And it's going to kill all the weeds, but corn is going to grow just fine. Okay. And there are some different types of pesticides. I'm not going to get too deep into it. You guys can read through here. The one thing that I do want to point out is the persistent pesticide. Pesticide. I can't talk. And that's the one that will remain in the environment for a really long time. Okay, so those are the ones that we need to be careful about. If you continue to apply a pesticide, eventually what's going to happen is you are going to develop resistance to that pesticide. It's evolution 101, right? If you think back to when we did the lab with the beads, right? If you had certain beads that were wiped out because of whatever the impact was, their offspring now were at an advantage because they carried them whatever mutation there was. Well, if you have cockroaches in your restaurant, for example, and you bring in a pest control company and they come in and they spray, and there are a handful of cockroaches that have a genetic mutation that makes them resistant to that pesticide. Well, now that handful of cockroaches is going to reproduce, and chances are that their offspring are going to have the same resistance to that pesticide. So a couple of things will need to happen. You will either increase the amount of pesticide that you will use to make it, a stronger dose. Hopefully that will kill them off. Or you might need to develop a new pesticide. That cockroach now is not resistant to it anymore. So this is pretty much what this image is showing you, the flow chart here, right? You apply some pesticide, it kills off most of the pests. Some of them are going to survive and reproduce, causing an issue later on. We are going to talk a little bit about genetic engineering. It does allow us to change the amount of food that we can produce and the way that we can produce it. Okay? We no longer have to use as much pesticides because they might be pest resistant. Okay? You may have a higher yield of production because you can spray Roundup on that field, so now your plants don't need to compete with weeds. If you have a higher yield, obviously the farmer is going to have a higher profit. There are, of course, some concerns that people share about GMOs. Number one is safety. Right? At what point do we say, okay, we are no longer going to manipulate the genetic makeup of this plant? However, we've been manipulating genetically our plants since the beginning of farming. People would collect the seeds of the best fruit, right? And then plant them for later. They wouldn't plant the crappy fruit seeds, right? They want to grow the ones that produce the best fruit. So we actually have been manipulating that genetic makeup for a really long time. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. We will need to finish this. We'll probably have to record a separate notes system just for the rest of this, but I know the bell is going to ring here in a couple of minutes.